Sometimes a single event or story can change all of history, or even a person's life. Today, you're about to hear a truth just like that. And if you miss the final moment, you'll miss everything. So before we begin, subscribe to this small channel and press the bell icon to get new video notifications. And tell me in the comments what topic you want next video. Now, imagine this. You're standing inside a modern European museum, maybe the kind where school groups shuffle around while clutching worksheets and teachers pretend to stay awake. Behind a glass wall sits a battered piece of stone, just a fragment, nothing dramatic at first glance. But the label underneath reads, "Inscription from a house church, late 2nd century." You lean closer, and the carved letters seem almost shy, like they've been whispering for centuries. Suddenly, your mind flickers, not in the cinematic way, but in that eerie, subtle shift where the present dissolves. The museum lights fade. The chatter of tourists falls silent. And in that moment, you're not just looking at an artifact. You're standing inside the world where the Catholic Church was being born, long before anyone called it Catholic, long before power and cathedrals and popes and councils. That's where your journey actually begins. Not in Vatican City, not in Renaissance glory, not even with Constantine, but in a cracked empire stumbling through darkness. A fractured empire awakens. You're walking through the final centuries of the Roman Empire, and it feels like wandering inside a house where every pillar has begun to rot. Nothing collapses all at once, but everything is trembling all the time. Armies are stretched thin. The economy hisses like a dying flame. Emperors appear and vanish like lottery winners who forgot to buy a ticket. You can almost taste the anxiety in the air, the sense that something enormous is ending, even if nobody dares say it out loud. And in this collapsing world, you start noticing small pockets of people who aren't worshiping Jupiter or Mars or any of the old Roman gods. They gather quietly, sometimes in basements, sometimes in rented rooms or graveyards. They don't look powerful. They don't act ambitious. They're mostly poor, mostly ordinary, and mostly trying very hard not to get arrested. And yet there's something different about them, something almost stubbornly hopeful. They call each other brothers and sisters. They talk about a man executed by Rome but still proclaimed as a king. They talk about love in a world shaped by conquest. They talk about equality in an empire built on hierarchy. They even share meals across class lines, which in Rome is about as shocking as a senator voluntarily paying taxes. This is the seed stage, the part of the story nobody glamorizes. You don't see miracles blazing across the sky. You just see tiny, fragile communities forming in the cracks of a dying empire. You see whispered prayers, scribbled copies of letters, hand-drawn fish symbols beside doorways. And you realize something surprising. The church didn't begin as a monument. It began as a shelter for ideas, for people, and for hope. Hidden followers in the shadows. You step into one of those early gatherings and immediately you feel the tension. Not the dramatic sword at the door kind, but the heavy, quiet fear that lives in the chest of anyone who knows a wrong word can mean prison or worse. The early Christians aren't heroic in the Hollywood sense. They're tired, nervous, and constantly glancing over their shoulders. The Roman government doesn't hate them because of theology. Rome could care less about theology. Rome hates them because they refuse to sacrifice to the emperor, and that refusal looks suspiciously like rebellion. So the Christians hide, not because their faith is weak, but because their lives are fragile. You sit beside them on a rough wooden bench. Someone reads from a scroll, Paul's letters maybe, or an early gospel not yet bound into a book. The handwriting is uneven, smudged, clearly copied in a hurry. But the words carry a strange certainty that all people are equal before God, that love is stronger than death, that power isn't the final truth. Outside, the empire demands loyalty. Inside, the room is filled with a different kind of loyalty, one you can feel tightening around you like a protective cloak. And the strangest part, the more the empire tries to stamp them out, the more the movement grows. Persecution doesn't scare them away, it sharpens them, unites them, and gives their message an intensity nothing else could. The harder Rome breathes down their necks, the stronger their sense of purpose becomes. And you begin to understand why this movement survived when others didn't. It wasn't wealth, or politics, or military strength. It was conviction, a conviction so firm that even the threat of death couldn't dissolve it. And slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, these hidden followers start shaping the moral compass of the empire that persecutes them. An unlikely rise to power. Then, the unthinkable happens. Rome, exhausted from wars, political assassinations, and a never-ending parade of incompetent emperors, finally hits a breaking point. New leaders rise, and among them comes a man whose decisions will twist the future of the church in ways no early Christian could have imagined. But before we get to Constantine, your future self is edging toward him, but not yet. You must walk through the years when Christianity moved from secret to survivable. It begins with small legal tolerances, unofficial protections, sympathetic governors who decide that persecuting peaceful believers isn't worth the paperwork. And you start noticing a pattern. The Christians are incredibly organized for people living in fear. They have leaders, bishops, who communicate across cities. They share teachings, solve disputes, and even send money to communities in crisis. They aren't just a faith, they're becoming a network. And while Rome weakens, Christianity strengthens. While Roman gods lose followers, Christ gains them. While Roman culture ages, Christian ideas spread like wildfire. You watch a strange exchange happening silently. The empire's structural strength flows downward, and the church's moral strength flows upward. One is falling, the other is rising, and soon they will collide. The transition isn't clean or quick. It's messy, filled with political games, regional tensions, theological arguments, and more than a few misunderstandings between believers themselves. But you can feel momentum building beneath your feet, like the ground is shifting and you're being carried towards something vast and inevitable. And finally, when Constantine enters the stage, everything you witnessed, every hidden prayer, every underground gathering, every whispered scripture explodes out of the shadows and into the center of world history. You don't realize it yet, but the Catholic Church as you know it, the institution, the hierarchy, the enormous influence, will all trace its roots to this exact moment. The moment when a small, persecuted faith becomes visible enough to shape empires. But the story is just warming up.
You barely have time to absorb the moment when Christianity steps cautiously out of the shadows before history shoves you straight into a political storm because the Roman Empire, still staggering, is about to make a decision that no emperor before had dared to make. And the strange part? It doesn't start with a choir of angels or a dramatic revelation from heaven. It starts with an emperor who wants to win. You're standing beside Constantine, a man who carries ambition the way soldiers carry swords, tightly, confidently, and with absolute conviction that he was born to use it. His empire is fractured, his rivals are sharpening their blades, and the future of Rome looks like a cracked mosaic ready to fall apart. Then comes the famous moment, the vision, the shimmering symbol in the sky, the words, "In this sign conquer." You can debate whether it was a miracle, a dream, a political strategy, or some combination of all three, but what matters is how Constantine interprets it. He sees the Christian symbol as a weapon, not of violence, but of legitimacy. He orders the Chiro painted on shields. He marches into battle carrying the emblem of a faith that the empire had been persecuting for centuries. And when he wins, when he becomes the power Rome desperately needs, Christianity suddenly shifts from a hunted underground movement to a religion backed by imperial favor. But here's the twist. Constantine doesn't convert because he wants to become a saint. He converts because he wants unity. Rome is falling apart, and Christianity is the one group that seems strangely organized, disciplined, loyal, and, most importantly, capable of binding people together. You walk beside him through palace halls as he drafts what will become the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, the law that legalizes Christianity and restores confiscated properties. He doesn't make it the official religion, that happens later, but he throws open the doors that once hid the early Christians. In a single stroke, he shifts Christianity from a crime to a protected religion. And you can feel the tremors of that decision echo across the empire. The hidden house churches come blinking into the light. Bishops emerge like generals from the fog, revealing networks more extensive than the emperor imagined. Suddenly, Christianity isn't just a spiritual idea, it's a political force. And Constantine realizes something crucial. If he wants stability, he needs Christianity to be united. But Christianity is not united. And that brings you to the fight that will shape what Christianity, and eventually the Catholic Church, officially becomes. You're transported into a massive hall in Nicaea in 325 CE, and it feels like stepping into the world's earliest and most intense academic debate club. Only this time, the stakes include the soul of the empire and the identity of a global religion. Rows of bishops sit in heavy chairs, wearing simple robes but carrying immense authority. Their expressions range from exhausted to furious. Some bear scars from past persecutions. Others have traveled from distant provinces with scrolls stuffed into their bags. And they're all here for one reason. Before this council, believers shared the same faith, but not always the same definitions. Was Jesus fully divine? Fully human? A mix? A creation? Eternal? Something else? One man, Arius, argues that Jesus is divine, but not equal to the Father, that there was a time when he was not. Others insist the opposite, that Christ has always existed, that he is of one substance with the Father. And Constantine, hoping for unity, sits at the edge of the room like a referee who desperately wants the teams to stop throwing chairs. He doesn't understand the theology, few emperors would, but he understands politics. A divided church means a divided empire. And so the arguments rage. You can feel the tension, the passion, the frustration, the fear that the wrong definition might tear Christianity apart. Voices echo off stone walls, scrolls unfurl. Men who survived prisons, torture, exile, and execution threats now face a different threat: division from within. Finally, after weeks of debate, the council forges something new: the Nicene Creed. The words ring out like a proclamation: God from God, light from light, true God from true God. For the first time, Christianity has an authoritative, empire-approved, unified statement of belief. And this moment becomes a cornerstone of what will eventually define the Catholic Church: the idea that doctrine can be standardized, debated, clarified, and defended. The council ends not with victory celebrations, but with exhausted relief. But you can tell this isn't the last time the church will gather like this. Councils will become a defining feature, moments when leaders come together to shape the theology, structure, and direction of the church. But while these debates rage, another transformation is happening beneath your feet. The Bishop of Rome, the quiet figure in the corner of these historical moments, is slowly gaining gravity, authority, and a title that will one day reshape the world. You step into the city of Rome, not the glowing classical Rome of postcards, but a Rome struggling with decay, poverty, and identity. It's no longer the invincible capital of an empire, it's a wounded city. And in the midst of the political rubble, one office stands out like a lantern in a storm: the Bishop of Rome. He's not called Pope yet, at least not in the modern sense, but people look to him in ways they don't look to other bishops. His authority isn't political. It's historical, rooted in the belief that he sits on the spiritual chair once held by Peter, the apostle. And that idea is powerful. You watch as bishops across the empire begin writing to him when disputes arise. They ask for advice, arbitration, clarity. His responses carry weight, not because he commands armies or wealth, but because tradition whispers that Peter himself once walked these streets. The Bishop of Rome becomes something like a spiritual anchor in a sea of chaos. When emperors come and go, he remains. When wars shake the provinces, he remains. When councils argue, he becomes the one who interprets, approves, or guides. And slowly, almost invisibly, the papal office crystallizes, not through conquest, not through decree, but through responsibility. You sense a shift. Christianity is no longer a loose network of local communities. It's becoming a structured body with leadership. And Rome, the city that once ruled the world by force, is now beginning to influence it in a different way, through faith. The Bishop of Rome doesn't yet wear crowns or command armies, but the roots of the papacy, spiritual fatherhood, doctrinal authority, unity of believers, are already growing quietly beneath the surface. By the time you reach the end of this section, you've walked through one of the most dramatic transformations in human history. A persecuted faith becomes legal. A persecuted minority becomes a public institution. A scattered community becomes a unified body. A local bishop begins becoming a global leader. The story of how the Catholic Church starts is no longer a small, hidden tale. It's a force now, shaping emperors, defining doctrines, and laying foundations that will carry into the medieval world and beyond. But the moment you think things are stabilizing, history takes another turn. The empire cracks again, chaos surges, and the Church faces a new challenge, stepping into power not because it wants to, but because someone must. And that's where the next chapter begins.
The moment you step into the next chapter of history, the world feels different, not because Christianity has suddenly become stable, but because Rome is falling apart faster than anyone can repair it. And this time, the Church isn't creeping in the shadows or debating theology under vaulted ceilings. Now it's being pushed into the center of a collapsing civilization, whether it wants the responsibility or not. Power struggles in a broken world. Imagine walking through the streets of the late 4th and early 5th century Roman Empire. The air is thick with uncertainty. Smoke rises from distant towns. Soldiers look more like mercenaries than loyal defenders. And emperors, well, emperors disappear so often that people barely bother learning their names anymore. Rome, the mighty empire that once stretched across continents, is now more like a giant statue with cracks widening across its marble skin. But here's the strange thing. When secular power weakens, something else steps into the vacuum. You begin to see men in simple robes walking through the chaos. Not generals, not politicians, not wealthy elites, but bishops. They have no armies, no fortresses, no legions at their command. And yet, people flock to them. Not because the bishops are perfect or because they hold secret weapons, but because they are the only leaders who don't abandon their cities when trouble comes. Take the sack of Rome in 410 CE. While nobles flee for safer ground, bishops stay. They organize food, they shelter the vulnerable, they negotiate with invaders. They become the moral spine in a world where every political bone has snapped. And this time, the Church isn't creeping in the shadows or debating theology under vaulted ceilings. Now it's being pushed into the center of a collapsing civilization, whether it wants the responsibility or not. Power struggles in a broken world. Imagine walking through the streets of the late 4th and early 5th century Roman Empire. The air is thick with uncertainty. Smoke rises from distant towns. Soldiers look more like mercenaries than loyal defenders. And emperors, well, emperors disappear so often that people barely bother learning their names anymore. Rome, the mighty empire that once stretched across continents, is now more like a giant statue with cracks widening across its marble skin. But here's the strange thing. When secular power weakens, something else steps into the vacuum. You begin to see men in simple robes walking through the chaos. Not generals, not politicians, not wealthy elites, but bishops. They have no armies, no fortresses, no legions at their command. And yet, people flock to them. Not because the bishops are perfect or because they hold secret weapons, but because they are the only leaders who don't abandon their cities when trouble comes. Take the sack of Rome in 410 CE. While nobles flee for safer ground, bishops stay. They organize food, they shelter the vulnerable, they negotiate with invaders. They become the moral spine in a world where every political bone has snapped. And something unusual happens.
the church starts gaining influence by filling society's needs, not by grabbing power. You see governors asking bishops for advice. You see warlords making deals with bishops because the bishops are the only ones citizens trust. You see communities rallying around churches because they provide stability that the empire no longer can. It's not that the church is trying to rule, it's that someone has to be the adult in the room while Rome is busy self-destructing. As you follow this shift, you notice something else. Political power becomes localized. Kingdoms rise where provinces once stood. Germanic tribes settle where legions once marched. And in every new territory, you find bishops acting as bridges between old Roman traditions and new barbarian rulers. The Catholic Church is becoming something quietly monumental, a survivor that adapts without breaking, a network that endures even when the empire that legalized it collapses into dust. And in the middle of this transformation, an entirely different force emerges, one that you might not expect. The people who truly save civilization aren't emperors or generals, but men who choose silence, simplicity, and prayer. Monks who saved everything. You journey now to a quiet, remote valley somewhere in Italy. There, a small stone building stands, modest and unassuming. Inside, a group of men chant in low, rhythmic voices. They're not hiding, not running, not fighting. They're doing something far more radical in a world drowning in violence. They're preserving knowledge. Monasticism begins as a personal spiritual quest, people withdrawing from a corrupted society to pursue a pure life of prayer and discipline. But soon, monasteries evolve into something far bigger, fortresses of memory. Inside a dim room, monks sit hunched over wooden desks with quills dipped in ink. They copy texts word by word, scripture, theology, history, philosophy, science. Outside, kingdoms burn, rulers fall, and cities crumble. But inside, words survive, ideas survive, culture survives. You watch as one monk painstakingly copies a manuscript Aristotle wrote centuries earlier. His candle flickers, his hands ache, but he continues. He doesn't know it, but he's saving Western civilization. Elsewhere, monasteries become centers of agriculture, medicine, education, and hospitality. Travelers find shelter there. The poor are fed. The sick are tended. And as warlords and kings scramble for power, monks quietly become the custodians of humanity's intellectual inheritance. It's almost ironic that while politicians fight for thrones, men who have sworn vows of poverty end up shaping the future more profoundly. At the same time, monastic rules, especially the rule of Saint Benedict, create a disciplined lifestyle that influences not just monks, but the entire Catholic Church. Structure, obedience, community, prayer, these values seep into the bloodstream of Christian life. And gradually, monasteries become the quiet engines that drive Christian culture forward. When the dust of war settles, the only functioning institution in many regions is the church, and often the center of it is a monastery. But while monks are saving texts and stabilizing communities, the church itself is undergoing its own transformation. The rituals deepen, the structure solidifies, the identity crystallizes, and the Catholic Church begins to look like the church we recognize today. A new spiritual blueprint. You follow the church from hidden gatherings to imperial debates, from persecution to legalization, from scattered communities to organized networks. But now you're entering the stage where early Catholic traditions become the blueprint for centuries of spiritual life. You walk into a 6th century church and you notice something familiar. Candles, incense, liturgical chants, altars, vestments. None of this appears out of nowhere. It takes shape slowly as communities try to express the sacred in visible, consistent ways. The Eucharist becomes more formalized. Baptisms take on rich symbolism. Feasts and fasts structure the year. Saints and martyrs become spiritual companions whose stories inspire believers. The sign of the cross becomes universal. Latin becomes the unifying language of worship in the West. And at the center of this emerging identity is the idea that the church is not just a community. It's a body with structure and meaning in every part. You begin to see how bishops become shepherds, how dioceses form, how parishes grow, how councils and creeds anchor belief. It's not chaos anymore. It's architecture, not of stone, but of meaning. And above it all, one figure begins to stand out even more clearly: the Bishop of Rome. Across continents, Christians start referring to him with increasing reverence. His letters shape practice, his judgments shape doctrine. His authority, though not yet absolute, grows because people want a unifying voice. Meanwhile, the world around the church remains turbulent. Invasions come and go. Kingdoms rise and fall like waves in a storm. But the church becomes the shoreline, shifting slightly with each wave, but never disappearing. By the time this section closes, you realize something profound. The Catholic Church didn't survive because it was powerful. It became powerful because it survived. It learned to bend without breaking, to guide without ruling, to preserve without conquering. And in that survival, it built the foundations of a spiritual and cultural identity that will soon step into medieval Europe and reshape everything from kingship to law to literacy. You've walked with the church through imperial collapse, monastic resilience, and the formation of traditions that will last more than a millennium. Now the story moves into a world of kings, popes, and missionaries, a world in which the church doesn't just survive history, it becomes one of history's architects.
You move through the next chapter almost without noticing how far the world around you has shifted, because by the time you reach the 4th century, the Roman Empire is exhausted, bloated, fractured, bleeding from its borders, and yet somehow still the most powerful force on earth. And in the middle of this collapsing giant, something unlikely begins to happen. The small, persecuted community you've been following almost like a whisper suddenly becomes a voice that can no longer be ignored. You can picture it as if you're standing there in the dusty streets of Rome, traders shouting prices, soldiers clashing shields, senators pacing in frustration, slaves carrying jars, and in the shadows, always in the shadows, groups of Christians gathering quietly in homes, lighting tiny oil lamps that flicker against coarse clay walls as they pray a faith they know could still cost them everything. But the empire is large and unwieldy, and even an emperor can't devote his entire attention to stamping out a movement that keeps sprouting up wherever the ground is most fertile. So the Christian story moves forward not because its followers are strong, but because they are stubborn, and because the empire is tired. And eventually, the two paths that have been running uneasily side by side collide in a way that no one could have predicted. When Constantine rises to power, you feel the shift like the sudden clearing of a fog. You're watching a man driven by ambition, pressured by politics, bruised by civil war, who is not yet a saint in anyone's eyes, just a ruler trying to control a fractured empire. But something in him turns toward the Christians, and whether you believe it was a sincere religious experience or a calculated political move, the result is the same. Christianity, for the first time, steps into the light. You can almost see the moment in your mind, the banners bearing the mysterious symbol, the soldiers looking confused but obedient, the emperor raising his eyes toward the sky and swearing that what he saw above the battlefield has changed everything. Whether that moment happened exactly as the legends say isn't the point. What matters is what he did next. He ends the persecutions. He returns confiscated property. He begins funding the building of churches. And as you walk through this part of history, you feel the surreal weight of it. The hunted become protected. The punished become privileged. And over the next decades, the entire identity of the empire begins to tilt. Of course, nothing shifts cleanly. The Christian communities you've been watching develop, each with their own customs, regional practices, interpretations, and leadership structures, don't magically transform into one unified body just because an emperor says so. They argue, they clash, they break into factions over questions that seem simple on the surface but carry enormous consequences. Who exactly is Jesus? Fully divine? Fully human? Something in between? How should bishops be chosen? Who has final authority when churches disagree? And as these arguments intensify, you can feel the pressure building like heat under a pot. The emperor wants unity. The bishops want clarity. The people want certainty. That's why the councils begin, not as mystical religious gatherings, but as urgent meetings summoned by the highest authority in the land to settle disputes that could tear the empire apart. You walk into the Council of Nicaea as if you're entering a room charged with static electricity. You see bishops in traveling clothes, some scarred from past torture, others carrying scrolls filled with arguments. You see advisors, scribes, imperial officials trying to keep order. And at the center of it all is a single question that will define the Church's future. How should Christians understand the nature of Christ? The debate is fierce. Voices rise. Arguments clash like swords. But eventually, after days of pressure, prayer, and politics, the bishops agree on a unified formula. And for the first time, the Church speaks with a single official voice. The creed that emerges becomes a cornerstone, not only a statement of belief, but a test of belonging. And here is where you start to see something unexpected forming, the slow transformation of a spiritual movement into an institution. Because once you have a creed, you need guardians of the creed. Once you have official teaching, you need an official teaching office. The bishops who once operated semi-independently now find themselves woven into a structure that keeps getting tighter. And naturally, as the need for central coordination grows, the Bishop of Rome begins to stand out. You've seen him before, one leader among many, respected but not commanding. Now, almost without noticing, his influence expands. His letters are copied and distributed. His decisions are consulted by other regions. His authority becomes a point of reference, not because he has an army, but because the Church is learning that unity requires a center. You follow this transition, almost like watching scaffolding being built around a growing building. Each council, each debate, each struggle over doctrine becomes another beam, another brace. And by the late 3rd century, something extraordinary happens. Christianity is not just tolerated, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. You can imagine what that does to the ground beneath your feet. Suddenly, bishops gain legal power. Church courts operate alongside imperial courts. Pagan temples lose funding. Public life becomes flavored with Christian language and rituals. But with privilege comes danger. You can sense it almost immediately as church leaders begin to navigate the tricky balance between spiritual authority and political power. They start influencing laws, advising emperors, shaping public morality. And although many of them are sincere, dedicated, and even saintly, the transformation is undeniable. A movement built on the idea of humility and service now finds itself intertwined with wealth, influence, and imperial favor. As you walk through this era, the streets of Rome feel different. The old temples echo with emptiness. New basilicas rise with grandeur. Pilgrims flock to them. Clergy gain respect. The Bishop of Rome, eventually known simply as the Pope, gradually becomes the figure everyone looks to when disputes arise. Not because he conquered anything, but because history pushed the Church toward a need for a stable anchor in a world that was becoming more unstable by the day. And instability arrives with a crash. When the Western Roman Empire begins to crumble, barbarians push at its borders, generals betray emperors, wealth dries up, cities weaken, and suddenly the only institution still standing, still literate, still organized, still present in every town, is the Church. If the empire is a body collapsing, the Church is the skeleton that remains, holding something together so society doesn't simply fall into dust. And you watch, almost in disbelief, as the Bishop of Rome steps into a role no one originally designed for him. Not only a spiritual guide, but the last symbol of unity in a fracturing world. When barbarian chiefs enter cities, it is often the pope they negotiate with. When people lose trust in rulers, it is the church they turn to. And by the end of this period, you feel the transformation complete, the beginnings of an institution that will dominate European spiritual, cultural, and political life for the next 1,000 years. But even here, the story isn't finished. You're standing on the edge of a cliff, looking out at a medieval world forming, one where kings, monks, popes, and entire nations will reshape what the church becomes. And the only way to understand that future is to walk into it step by step.
By the time you reach the medieval period, the world feels like it has been remade from the rubble of empire. You're walking across Europe, but it's no longer the sweeping, organized Roman landscape you might expect. Instead, kingdoms rise and fall like islands in a stormy sea, and yet one institution quietly threads itself through every corner of the continent: the Catholic Church. Its presence is subtle but unmistakable, and its influence is enormous. Wherever you turn, whether it's in the stone walls of a monastery, the bustling streets of a town, or the distant villages clinging to the edges of forests, you sense its authority shaping daily life, even in ways that most people barely notice. The medieval turning point. You're observing a world that is not static. It's dynamic, dangerous, and full of opportunities. Kings and lords fight for control, while peasants struggle to survive. And in this chaos, the church emerges as a stabilizing force, not just spiritually, but practically. Monasteries continue to preserve knowledge, bishops mediate disputes, and the pope slowly consolidates influence across nations. The church is no longer just surviving, it is thriving, stepping into roles that the secular powers have abandoned or cannot maintain. You walk through the streets of early medieval towns and notice that every aspect of public life is subtly infused with church authority. Laws reflect Christian morality, charitable institutions grow out of religious guidance. The calendar itself is dictated by feast days and holy observances, and the very rhythm of daily life is intertwined with prayer, mass, and ritual. In many ways, the church has become a governing framework without wielding the sword directly, a unique blend of moral, spiritual, and social power that no other institution has managed to achieve. Yet the church's growing authority is double-edged. The more powerful it becomes, the more it attracts challenges. You witness the first signs of tensions that will ripple through centuries. Debates between the pope and kings over who has ultimate authority, disputes between regional bishops over interpretation, and the push and pull between spiritual goals and worldly influence. It's clear that the church has grown into a position where it can both protect and control, comfort and command, inspire and intimidate, and this delicate balance will define much of the medieval period. You notice the emergence of elaborate cathedrals, monumental in both size and symbolism. They are not just places of worship, they are statements. Standing within the vaulted spaces, you sense how architecture itself becomes a language of power. Every stained glass window, every carved pillar, every soaring arch communicates the church's reach, authority, and permanence. Even illiterate peasants can feel the grandeur and significance. These structures aren't merely buildings. They are visual proof that the church has become an unshakable force in society, a beacon of both faith and influence. The seeds of future conflict. But stability carries its own risks, and you start to see the subtle tensions forming that will one day erupt into major conflicts. The church, now deeply intertwined with politics and society, faces internal pressures from differing theological interpretations, regional practices, and rival claims to authority. You walk through council halls and monasteries, observing heated debates that often seem trivial on the surface, but carry profound consequences for the future. Who decides what is orthodoxy? How should clergy be educated, appointed, and disciplined? When does the church step into temporal affairs, and when should it retreat? Externally, rulers and kingdoms begin to test the church's authority.
You witness confrontations between popes and kings, moments when the pope excommunicates a monarch or a ruler defies the church entirely. These are not isolated incidents. They were the opening acts of centuries-long patterns of negotiation, compromise, and confrontation. The church is powerful, but its power is precarious, tied not only to faith, but to the fragile web of human politics. You also notice the cultural tensions emerging. Latin remains the language of liturgy and administration, creating a divide between clergy and laity. Local customs sometimes clash with central directives, and missionary work to convert distant tribes occasionally sparks conflict with indigenous beliefs. And yet through all this, the church's network continues to expand, knitting together a patchwork of peoples, languages, and territories under a shared religious identity. The very conflicts you see are in a way evidence of its success. If it were weak or irrelevant, no one would challenge it at all. A legacy that still echoes. As you step back from the chaos and the grandeur, you start to see the long view. The Catholic Church's early centuries set patterns that will reverberate through history. Its survival during empire collapse, its role in shaping law and morality, its cultivation of education and knowledge, its negotiation of power with kings and emperors, all of these become precedents for centuries to come. The Church has become a living institution, adaptable yet structured, spiritual yet political, local yet universal. You witness the rise of universities, the spread of monastic schools, and the codification of canon law. You see saints' lives written down and celebrated, feasts standardized, rituals institutionalized. Through it all, the Church's authority continues to deepen, influencing not only what people believe, but how they organize their lives, their communities, and even their governments. The Catholic Church has become more than a faith. It is a culture, a framework for civilization itself. And the echoes of its early history remain embedded in modern institutions. The very idea of centralized religious authority, the balance between spiritual and temporal power, the careful preservation and transmission of knowledge, these are all products of the Church's formative centuries. From humble gatherings and hidden rooms to the magnificent cathedrals that dominate city skylines, the Church's story is one of adaptation, resilience, and enduring influence. As the medieval world continues to unfold, you recognize a pattern. The seeds planted in the earliest centuries, the hidden house churches, the persecuted believers, the councils and creeds, the monastic scribes, have grown into a living legacy that continues to shape societies across Europe and beyond. You realize that understanding the Church's early history is not just an academic exercise. It's a lens for seeing how power, culture, and faith intertwine, sometimes in ways that persist for